Welcome back, guys. Market is having a big crash now. Wow. So if you look at the portfolio, the performance on Friday, almost like entire things is red, right? And then it's not like a light rate. For example, you see Nvidia down by 5%, Amazon 5%, Tesla 5%. So it's a huge drop. So in today's episode, I will cover the reasons of why this drop, and then I will give my opinions on what's going on and the outlook from here. Okay, let's start. So for Bitcoin, crypto markets are also about the same. So this is recorded as of this morning, and I'm looking at past 1 week chart here. So Bitcoin down 10%, Ethereum down 70%. So crypto market also a big wipe up. So a lot of liquidations happening. If we look at S&P 500, it's down 2.7%. It's a huge drop. So later we will compare against when was the last time it dropped more than this kind of magnitudes. And then for QQQ, it was down 3.5%. The things that is up is gold, consistently outperformed this year, up 1.1% on Friday night. Then if you look at this chart, right, this is showing the daily movement. Friday night, 10th of October, down 2.7% for S&P 500, right? So if you look back, right, I think it has been 6 months we have never encountered this kind of larger drop. And then, of course, during April, tariff tantrum, those period, of course, we have some days that is down even more. But after that, it was fairly calm for the past 6 months, and then suddenly we have this 2.7% drop. So 2.7%, remember, this is only 1 day. We are still not sure what will happen over the next week. I mean, of course, there's a lot of speculations, right? It depends on the negotiations between China and US. But remember, this is only day one, yeah? Okay, 2.7% down. But if we just look at this 1 day drop, right, I think this is still not that concerning, because if you look at the chart, we are now just go back to around 9th of September, right, where the S&P 500 was around 6,500 points. So it's not like we set back all the gains for the past 3 months, 6 months, or 1 year, right? This is just like we go back 1 month ago. This is also because the performance in September is very strong. So now we just give back all these gains. Then QQQ is also go back to around 12th of September. So that's similar. In terms of the 1 day performance, right, if we look at sector, right, of course, technology and consumer cyclical, these two dropped down the most. Energy also affected. So almost all sector got hit. It's just like technology. I think all the tech stocks are affected more than the other sectors. If you look at the names, this one, I only filter for those like the larger cap one. So if you look at the names, right, there are quite a number of them came from software, semiconductor, communication equipments, specialty chemicals, all the industrial companies, they are also affected. So in terms of the range of the drop, right, it ranged from negative 7% to close to 10% for all these larger cap. Of course, for the smaller caps, there are many companies that drop even more. VIX, over the past 5 days, VIX really shot up. So it was around 16, 17, now shot up to 22. But if you look at, compare this period versus April during tariff tantrum, right, we are still fairly mild, because let's call it like 22 points, right, for VIX. But during those periods, we are up to about 50, right? So still relatively mild, but I mean, up by 30% is rather a big increase. It's just that it was increased from a very low base. So I think market has been very calm for a while, right? And then suddenly just boom, now give you a shock here. In terms of fear and greed index, we are about 26 or 27 here. So already in fear territory, but not at extreme fear. So if you look at the index, right, and look at the time series, right, you can see for about 6 months, we are above 50, right? So market is very calm, very happy. People are showing their portfolio, showing screenshot. Wow, see how much I gained this year. Then now we don't know whether this one will be another extreme fear, and maybe we will give up all the gains for this year. Who knows, right? So that's why people are very concerned right now. Okay. In terms of what happened, I think they all started with this Truth Social post by Donald Trump, right? I won't read all the details here. Basically, this is talking about export controls for the rare earth materials. Later, I will cover this topic in more details, but I think this is the start, because after this post came out, right, I think there's also another one followed up by Donald Trump's, also similar things. Basically, he's claiming that China suddenly is behaving very weird, try to impose all this control on rare earth materials. It might have a big impact given that China control almost the entire rare earth materials, right? So, and all these rare earth materials, they are very important ingredient or important input for a lot of stuff, including industrial stuff, manufacturing, EV, green energy, semicon, data center. All this, it's not like it takes up a huge input. It's just that small input, right? If US side they can't import from China, right? Then maybe all this development might be affected, right? So I think this is also why on the US side, on the Western side, they are very concerned if China pulls something crazy, like do a total blockage on all these rare earth materials. So now it's a bit like jittery at the moment, but I will go into the details why or should we be overly worried about this. Okay, in terms of like how to understand these situations, right? I think this post on X, right, by Ask Perplexity, I don't know how Perplexity AI models, right, they're able to pull out this. I won't say it's 100% accurate, but I think it's very useful for those who are new to all these rare earth materials related stuff and why this is sometimes like can be seen as concerning. I'll go through this. There's about like 10 or I think 12 posts here. Then just quickly cover all this, and then I'll come back and give my view on the situations here. So 9 October, right, China Ministry of Commerce issued announcement number 61 and 62, expanding rare earth export controls to 12 of 70 elements and imposing extraterritorial licensing requirements. So this is a direct retaliation for US semiconductor export bans announced days earlier. So I think the important things or the key things here is that China controls 70% of global mining, 90% of processing, and 93% of permanent magnet productions. And then talking about like defense industry, right? Each F-35, which is the fighter jets, right, require 417 kg of rare earth. China refines 100% of global samarium. This samarium is one of the rare earth materials. So then why suddenly they're pulling this, right? Timing is everything. The announcement came days after US expanded chip export bans and weeks before two critical deadlines: 90-day US-China trade truce expires and Trump-Xi meetings in South Korea. Then about rare earths 101, there are 17 elements. Sometimes all these names, right, is even quite hard to pronounce. This one, lanthanide, yttrium, scandium, critical for high-tech applications, magnet, lasers, semiconductors. So the thing about rare earths is that they are not rare geologically, meaning you can find it almost everywhere in the world. But the problem is that in terms of the concentrations, right, it's only 0.1 to 1% concentrations. I think this one is quite, how to say, like a high-level understanding. But if you look into the details, maybe it is not as rare as 1%, you know, because some of the right, places that they do minings, right, some places they are highly concentrated for certain type of rare earths, right, it could be in the range of like 3, 5, even close to 10%. But the problem is that to refine it, right, is very costly. Costly in the sense of like you need to spend money, and costly to the environment, because you might create a lot of all these, what do you call it, radioactive byproducts, thorium. So that's why aside from China, especially those US or Western countries, right, if possible, they don't want to do all this refinement because of the cost to the environmental. But China, they are fine. They are doing all this and they control the refinements. They control the creations of all these rare earth materials and magnets. So that's why they have a monopoly in this space here. What's actually restricted? So I won't go through the names because let's say if you read the names also, you are like me, right? We have no clue on all these things. I think in terms of where they are being used is a lot more important, because there are basically few areas, right? Defense is an important one. Aside from defense will be all these semicon, EV, battery, data center, all these places. So you know which sectors will be affected if suddenly China say, I'm going to restrict all this and I don't allow the export of all these rare earth materials. So this is, in terms of the impact, is more important. Foreign products, I think this one is quite key, because now it's not just China trying to restrict the export of rare earths, right? They are also saying that, let's say if you produce your products in a country outside of China, and as long as whatever that you are producing have more than 0.1% of Chinese source rare earth, right, then you need Beijing export license for re-export. Say for example, let's say ASML, right, they produce all these UV machines to US or Taiwan, right? As long as, if you look at the machines, they are using all these Chinese source rare earth, right, then they need Beijing export license. So if Beijing say no, you cannot export, then ASML cannot export. So that's why if you just read the rules, right, it's very, very, you can call it crazy, but it is not as crazy as this is not like the first time country do this kind of things, right? Because US themselves, right, they also do similar things. For example, they are blocking ASML, which are Netherlands companies, right? They restrict ASML export to China. Now China just want to do the same thing. As long as you are using their materials, they will just say, okay, you cannot export outside unless you get my approval. So that is something that is like, okay, it seems that kind of like quite sensitive and quite crazy kind of move, but need Beijing approval doesn't mean that, oh, there's no approval at all, right? As long as we are in good terms, when it comes to negotiations, then of course all this approval can be granted, right? So that's why I think all these things, right, is not just about like, oh, China, they are like, oh, I don't want to sell rare earth materials to US, to other countries anymore. Everything I want to keep for myself. It's not that. It's just like they are using these rare earth materials to just announce to the world that, hey, I have this thing here, so you all depending on me anyway, you need to get my license. So let's say if I approve give all this license to you, you better give something that I want, I demand, right? So that's why all this is just form part of the negotiations between US and China. So I think this is true even for tools that's made in Taiwan or Vietnam or Texas. So basically everywhere, they are all covered within these new rules here. In terms of the controls, right? End use bans, no licenses for foreign militaries or weapons. Case by case review for less than 14 nanometer chips, more than 256 layer memory, AI, military R&D, technology and labor, ban on exporting rare earth elements, mining, processing, recycling tech. Chinese citizens needs government approval to join overseas rare earth elements projects. Full compliance, December 2025. So I think this one, you can see, right, there are few applications. For militaries, right, I think these are the areas that China really, they wanted to tighten, because it doesn't make sense, right? I sell you rare earth materials today, and then you go and use it on your militaries, like all these laser guiding and so on, right? Then all these weapons will be used against China or China's friends, right? So it doesn't make sense for them to export these kind of things for militaries. Basically, I think for militaries related sectors, right, US or Western countries, right, they just have to source for all these materials elsewhere. They won't be able to source from China. I think they will really tighten, they will really say, okay, this is non-negotiable, so no more export of rare earth elements for US militaries. But for other stuff, right, say for example, EV, battery, all this data center, I would say that all these things, it doesn't make sense for China to stop the export, right? Because this is the areas where they can say, okay, I give you something, and then in return, maybe you have to give me what I wanted. So I think that basically that's the development at the moment. China dominance, the numbers. So this one I think we covered just briefly just now. Basically 70% of global share, but when it comes to separation, refining, it is like 90% or more, right? Say for example, permanent magnet productions, right? 93%. It's not like 100% is there in China, but the 7% outside of China, right, is simply not enough to meet all the demands. But this is today's situation, right? Doesn't mean that in the future, let's say if US or Western country, they see this as something like they don't want to be controlled by China, right? Then of course, they just have to have more refineries outside of China, right, to support their demand. But how much they want to do it is a question mark, right? Because to do it outside of China definitely is a lot more expensive, and you have to pollute your environment. So, but of course, you also won't say that, oh, I will just keep on relying on China, given that China is already pulled these kind of things, right? So I think in future, there will be more refineries outside of China. Say for example, Linus, Australian companies, right, which also have some refineries in Malaysia, right? So they might also increase their productions because there's more demand now outside of China, meaning all these US, they will really spend money to all these companies to say, okay, you have to step up. Maybe 93% or 90% upward, right, cannot be in this kind of situation in the future. So they just have to beef up or ramp up their productions. Defense impact. So like I mentioned, right, a lot of all these defense, fighter jet or submarine, they all use a lot of all these rare earth materials. They just have to source it elsewhere. Okay, cannot depend on China anymore. I think this is about the capability gap, talking about US versus China. But I think the good thing here is that China and US, as of today, they are still not in direct war, right? But the scary part is that China built military hardware 5 to 6 times faster than US. Let's say if they are involved in some sort of tension, right, then I think US side, they are also worried, because all these industrial, including rare earth elements, right, or other stuff, right, I think China, they are able to build a lot faster. So I think this one is something that why US always think that it's scary if you let China have so much power, right? So that's why they try to tekan China a lot, including using all these chip ban and so on. That's why there's all these clashes, because this is everything about the rise of China. And once you have two great power, right, then there will be all this fighting, right? Like 一山不能长二虎, these kind of situations. Semiconductor choke point. I think magnets in lithography equipments, wafer processing equipment. So there's all this equipment here and there that really need all these rare earth elements, right? So I think that's why all these semiconductor get hit. But I would say that this part, I don't think it's that worrying, because it is really crazy if China really ban the use of rare earth export for all these semiconductor, right? Because if semiconductor space really come to an halt, right, they stop producing, right, then the entire world, right, will be in huge problem. So I don't think China plan to do that. They just want to give people's warning that, hey, if you ban me too much, right, I have all this under my control. So it's a bit like, give a bit of warnings, and then before we come to the table and discuss, right? Because they also want some leverage when it comes to negotiations. All right, I think all this, in terms of immediate impact, there might be like, price spikes by 20 to 50% over the short term, right? But I think over the long term, this so-called, basically US and China, they have to do their own things, make sure that their supply chains can be independent of each other. I think this kind of things will happen more and more in the future. So I think what they call it decouplings, right? So So this post here is basically summarizing that decoupling isn't coming, it is already here. It's just that it is not like 100% decouple at like sudden decouples, right? It's more like there's flashes here and there. So, but the good thing is that I think from US side and from China sides, you imagine, right? Both sides, they don't want to come to a situation where we are lose, right? You don't give me rare earths, I don't give you any my access to my market, and then basically all die together, right? Who wanted that, right? So I think all this, right, it's just like, okay, flashes here and there. After that, they come to a table. They have to come to some sort of agreement, and then all these economies can flow, right? If not, making both sides painful, nobody win, right? So there must be some sort of win-win between these two major economies or two major power, right? The problem is that within that negotiations, what will happen? Who will sit more? Who will actually, agree to the demands from the other sides more? So these kind of things is very hard to predict. But I think all this, I don't think both sides are prepared to kill each other. We are not in those kind of situations. As it's more like they want to gain more and they want leverage in negotiations. So I think this is still new. I think we are probably going to see more as time, as we progress over the next few weeks. But I'm not 100% or I'm not too worried about these situations here, because I think China, in terms of their attitude, they are not, I don't think they are saying that we want to stop, like we want to ban everything. China, they are not behaving like that, thank God. But in terms of what I'm worrying, right, is more about like the situations that we are in at the moment. I'm referring to the stock market. So by the way, before we go there, just to show you some charts which is in the same post, right, showing that all these rare earth materials, China, they control a lot of all this refining capacity, right? Then so that's why they dominate rare earth materials. That's why they have some control here. But in terms of what I'm worrying at the moment, right, is more like these situations that we are facing. You see, the stock market is going up. Then suddenly now we have this beep here. Whoa, see, market is crashing. Those who are like keep on predicting crash, they must be happy, right? Say that, you see, I predicted. So, but if you look at how much it has dropped, right, it's only, like I mentioned earlier, only 1 month back, right? So then the situation or the concerning part is what? It's actually come back to the valuation, right? So if you look at the S&P 500, this is coming from JP Morgan Asset Management. So actually, I wanted to cover this material 1 or 2 weeks ago when they released this as of end of September, right? I wanted to cover this. It's just that there are other topics that are more interesting, but now I think we have to come back and look at the valuation, because right now, right, in terms of the forward PE, right, as of end of September, we are 22.8. This is more than one standard deviations from 30-year average of about 17, right? So when the market valuation is rather high, right, any small things here, right, like rare earth scare or some sort of like, okay, some tariff announcement here and there, you just need a little bit of like talking points, right, narrative, right? Then suddenly they will have all this like quite a big adjustment. And when all this big adjustment happen, right, then it will make more people scared, and then all this can play in a viral way, and suddenly you have like, oh wow, suddenly 15% kind of drop within 1 or 2 or 3 weeks, right? All this could happen. The reason is really because of the valuations. If valuation is already quite low, I believe people will be come in and just buy the dip, right? But here, given that valuation is high, even those who wanted to buy the dip also, they might be saying, okay, I might take a bit of time. I'm not that eager to come and support the market, right? So that's why the volatility can be higher just because of this. And if you look into the details, right, like I showed earlier, Magnificent 7, as of 10 of October, the forward PE is 29.3. So 29.3, although I might say that, okay, these companies, their quality is much better, margin much better, their growth rate is also much higher. But if you look at 29.3 of a forward PE, is still quite high as compared to just a few years ago, right? So that's why I would say that for whether it's S&P 500 or whether it's Magnificent 7, and especially when all these rare earth materials can potentially impact all this, the build out of AI data center, right? So that's why I'm perfectly understand that, okay, all this can have impact to stock market, and we might see a much larger drop over the next 1 week or 2 weeks or so, right? So it's all come back to valuations rather than, okay, the whole world is going to stop because of rare earth bans, right? So we are not like that. So basically, that's my take on this episode on why suddenly we have a big crash on Friday. So just to wrap up, right, it's all because of all these rare earth elements potential ban, but I don't think there will be a ban. It's more like just negotiation between these two superpower. In terms of the outlook, I believe they will come to a negotiation table and agree something that at least Trump will announce that's a win for US, and on the China side, they also announce a win, right? I think win-win for both definitely is something they are able to come up with. I'm not too worried about the rare earth elements bans. I'm more worried about the valuations at the moment, because valuation has been high. So let's say if you see some good buying opportunity, I mean, you can buy the dip, but just don't all in so fast before the market come back to a more reasonable valuations. So I would say that during this kind of like high valuations, right, it's good to always always have some cash buffer to help you, whether psychologically, emotionally, that will help you. If not, right, let's say if we have a much better discount in the future, at least you can use all this cash buffer, right? As always, invest safe, invest for the long term. Don't be panicked of this episode.